comes the question you may recall from the Nixon era.
What did he know and when did he know?
What did he know and when did he know? Exactly. And so it's to tell you all these things. Also, if you want to bring chairs from another room, it'd be great. We're way short. So I'm going to rejigger the talk. I was going to essentially just talk about, I was going to talk 10% about my own work and 90% about the history described in my new book, Geeks Bearing Gifts. But I think I've had so much interest expressed in my work since I've been here that I'm going to switch it around and talk 10% about the history of computers and 90% about my work, because after all, that's the important thing. Everybody gets their own Swarthmore education. You could say that everybody gets the Swarthmore education they deserve. For me, it was two things in particular. One was being proactive about fighting the curriculum, because, of course, you're supposed to come out a well-rounded major of X. And I didn't want to be a well-rounded major in anything. I wanted to know everything, okay? Remember in the Quaker meeting how they said, be a seeker after truth? Well, I took that seriously, and maybe some of you did too. But the whole curricular system is designed to prepare you for graduate school and to make you somebody else than you ought to be. Oh, please come in, please. Okay. Lift them high. Yeah? This is great. When they asked Churchill whether to rebuild the House of Commons in Victor, he said, oh no, we want it to be packed tight for a sense of occasion.
Yeah, thanks.
So I started taking courses at the University of Pennsylvania, Haverford, University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, but for my sophomore year, because I was preparing for honors, and I wanted to take all the things they didn't have here. And then, finally, I ended up doing the easy philosophy major. I dropped out of honors, not because I didn't, A, because I didn't want to sit through moral fill, and B, because there were so many things I hadn't learned yet. I didn't want to end my education. And I went to graduate school because I still felt there were things I really wanted to know, not because I wanted to be an academic. As it happened, I had discovered my true vocation just a month before graduation. My roommate Tony Poole and I got a $700 grant from the Student Council, Green Card Fund, to make a movie, and then abruptly, Tony died, which was a great shock for everyone. We just visited his mother in New Hampshire last month. But suddenly, before finals, I said, wait a minute, I've still got $700 to make a movie. Tony would have wanted me to, but there was no time to write a script. So I did something which is still arguable. I said, okay, I'll wing it, and I'll just have the actors say, park, park, and we'll fit the soundtrack on later, and it'll look funny. No, this divides people sharply. Because some people think it looks funny, it's like Yogi Bear, and some people think, it's disgusting, that's not a movie, that's something else. But in any case, I will now show you the first scene. What happened here?
Those things are complicated.
So I've tried to get to the classroom scene, if it's going to happen. Oh well, I guess it isn't. We were not fated to see the Epiphany of Slogan for today. I have a couple of DVDs, if anybody wants them. Oh, but this reminds me, in terms of back of the room sales, we do have copies of my new book. We have one copy of the ever classic Computer Lib, which is now going for $350. And copies of my book, The Home Computer Revolution, 1977, the book which predicted the downfall of IBM, and everyone laughed. I was invited by the IBM's captive share group that distributed share software for mainframes in the 1970s they asked me to speak, and I submitted the title, Dinosaurs Unite, the Mice Are Coming. And I got a communication that said, no, I had not been invited, and the person that I thought had invited me was not available for comment. But it all happened, but it took much longer than I thought. Okay, well, let's get back to this. Oh, boy. Well, I should begin to talk about it now. So, the other side of my Swarthmore education was that I did projects. And this was the main part of my Swarthmore education, really. When I sat in on the organizational meeting for a magazine called The Lit, and they were going to spend $800 to print a magazine, and I thought, this is ridiculous. And I printed my own little magazine called Nothing, it was very little, and I did it for $32.50 on what was the new form of photo homestead. Nobody told me how to do it, I just figured out how to do it. And one of the proudest moments of my life was when we were staying here on campus 10 years ago, and I bumped into Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, and he said, oh, Ted Nelson. Not the Ted Nelson who published Nothing magazine. So,
Nothing in the toilet. Remember that?
Nothing in the toilet.
Throw nothing in the toilet was in the back of all the women's
Oh.
doors.
I'd never made that connection. So, then I went on to make a two-color version of Nothing that was kite-shaped, and you had to rotate it as you turned pages. And I showed it to the printer beforehand. I showed him the mock-up, and he said, mm-hmm. But then when we finished the final version, he was astounded. And here I thought I'd done it with his approval. In fact, I did it all on my own. And it went on like this. I didn't ask how to make a movie. I made a movie. So I was used to seizing the reins of any new project. And when I got out of college, quite frankly, see, I know some of you thought I was immodest, but in fact, I only showed that amount of immodesty because underneath I was much more immodest. I really believed I could analyze anything, I could figure anything out, I could design anything, and I could show anything. Because I've made movies and won prizes for playwriting and so on. So this set me up. I couldn't decide between academia, because I felt somehow I could make a contribution in some field that hadn't been invented yet, and show business, because this was my true heart. I love making movies. It was my real talent, I believe. And I figured, well, I'll spend a couple of years in academia and then get back to making movies, which hasn't happened yet. So at this point, you see, I was set up for what was about to happen. A few other lines. In high school, I was very interested in photography and in layered effects, multi-layered effects. So, for example, how did Technicolor work? Technicolor worked with originally 3 big cameras and dichroic mirrors, splitting the beam between a red camera, a blue camera, and a green camera, each of which had its own negative running through. That is how Gone with the Wind was made. This triple Technicolor camera with 3 rolls of film. Then there was the True Color Bipack, which was done on the cheap for crappy-looking color with 2 layers of film. Then there was the design for how we would finally do color television. Now, my father was a playwright first, and then went into a new industry called television. And while I rarely saw him, I was raised by my grandparents, while I rarely saw him, he let me sit behind him in control rooms at CBS when I was a boy, like at age 9, 10, 11. And I was there one night, when camera 1 went out. The show was called Mama, the heartwarming show that some of you may remember. And the camera 1 was the boom camera, the one that could go up and down, that could go this high and this low. Whereas the others were pedestal cameras that could go this high and this low. Camera 1 went out in the beginning, and my father talked it through. He said, okay, camera 2 to the kitchen, camera 1 to the front porch, camera 3 to the front porch, camera 2 to the front porch, camera 3 to the living room. And he talked the whole show through seamless. But it had all been blocked for 3 cameras. At the end, the closing commercial, the control room exploded in applause because we saved the show, all being cool-headed. I watched a new medium being born from the inside. I knew that media were invented. I knew something about the history of film. I knew something about the history of broadcasting. At the same time, long-playing records had just come out. And in reply, RCA introduced the 45. And then tape recording came out. And we finally got Les Paul and Mary Ford playing 40 guitars at once from layer after layer of tape. So all these media, the layered media were coming in. I was talking about layers. A movie called When Worlds Collide showed Times Square being inundated by a great tidal wave. This was done by creating a miniature Times Square about 8 feet tall and 40 feet wide with blocks of wood painted black representing all the existing buildings. This was superimposed on a photograph of a real Times Square. Then the water was poured in. You had to slow down the camera because the water would pour very fast, but if you slowed down the camera, it would act like water sloshing in this tidal wave. Now, you made a traveling map, which is a mask, a negative mask showing the water, and a positive mask, male and female mask they're called, showing the cars on the street. Then you matted them all together, and boom, Times Square is inundated. I knew how all this was done early. It's the same as making a 3-color magazine. You're putting layer on layer on layer. It's all effects that are generated by a system of different generators, one on top of the other. But what is the guiding principle? The guiding question is, how do you want it to look? What is the effect you want? What is the cheapest way to make a monster? Show the reaction shot. Ah! And you don't even have to make a monster. So the issue is not how do you make a monster, it's how do you do the best show. Okay. So I call myself a philosopher and a filmmaker. Philosopher, I'd done some pretty good analysis. I was a philosophy major here, and I wrote a paper which turned out, which right off the top of my head, could be called an early work on knowledge representation by graph structure. I didn't know those terms. I did it off the top of my head in 1958, and it was exactly contemporaneous with similar work at MIT and Stanford. So the point is that intellectually I was also original. So I didn't know what to do. And of course, when you don't know what to do, you go to graduate school. And my second year in graduate school, I took a computer course. Now, what computers were out there at the time? Very few. What computer graphics designs machines were out there? Very few. They were building them up for A, air traffic control, and B, NORAD, nuclear weapons control. But to the best of my knowledge, there were not more than 100 computer displays in the world at that time. Nevertheless, I saw the pictures. I saw what computers could do. And I talked to the professors, and I talked to a few computer scientists at Harvard. I said, they don't know what they've got. It's a media machine! And we're going to be reading and writing from computer screens. Well, computers are huge things. And no. We heard Moore's law in whatever version they had at the time. They were going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and we could put screens on it. And it was obvious to me that this would be the medium of the future. And we'd be reading and writing on computer screens. And since there would be some form of data communication, who knew what, then the real issue would be to design the documents of the future. And I felt not only eminently qualified, I felt a huge moral obligation because I figured that if the techies did it, they would screw it up. And that is exactly what has happened. Now, I do not consider myself a techie. I call myself a systems humanist. Meaning, I care about human objectives, love and happiness, truth and beauty, and living well and saving the planet. And systems means trying to find the right things to do. Who else is a systems humanist? Well, my great hero Buckminster Fuller. He'd been a hero to me since I was 10. And he was trying to figure out ways to use energy better, save the planet. So, who's another systems humanist? Well, I can think of Leonardo da Vinci. We won't get into that. I don't pretend to be Bucky or Leonardo, but they don't pretend to be me either. Point is, I had my job to do, and I knew how to do it. Because the secret they were hiding from the public that outraged me was that computers were very simple. They're boxes that follow a plan. You write a plan, it's called a program, and now the damn thing does it. Now, of course, the God is in the details, as the Shakers said. Someone recently turned that on its head in a Manichaean fashion and said the devil is in the details. But if I have a religion, it's that God is in the details. So I felt eminently prepared because what was it? It was a philosophy machine. What do I mean by that? What is philosophy but the choice of generalizations? What is computer software design but the choice of ways in which to generalize a data structure, a programming language, the design of a program? The computer was a media machine. It was a movie machine. What is a movie? Interactive software is filmmaking. Okay, this is not a metaphor. This is not an analogy. Interactive software is movies. What is a movie? A movie is events on a screen that affect the heart and mind of the viewer. What is interactive software? Events on a screen that affect the heart and mind of the viewer and interact and have consequences. So, you're making a movie foremost, and the consequences and the interaction must be designed to fit. There's more room to sit down over here.
I'm going to grab a couple more
Yeah,
chairs.
great.
Anyone wants to go to the other side?
We need another piece of paper for your sign-up list.
Okay.
We need another roll.
This is fantastic. So let's run it on, start this around. Emails be good. Okay. So the,
Break your heart, give out another piece of paper. All these people are not going to fit on
I
that
just
side.
had. Oh,
I have
another
another
one?
one beyond
Yeah,
that.
okay, sure.
We're going to have to do it in a minute anyway.
You were printing pretty small.
No, I have to tell a key anecdote in my lifetime. When I was about 8 years old, my beloved grandfather, well, he had bought a pressure cooker. Pressure cookers had just come in, and pressure cookers of that day were kettles, aluminum kettles about so big, with a big heavy top. And this one had 2 round handles to release the top from the kettle. And in the middle, it had a valve. And when you flip the valve up, the steam would come out. And the idea was that you would cook whatever it was, and then let off the steam, and then turn the handles, and remove the top, and remove the contents. And my grandfather loved potatoes. He was Norwegian. And so the fact that you could cook potatoes in 15 minutes rather than an hour and a half was heaven to him. And this was all very fine until the night that he forgot to flip the valve. Turned the handles, and there was a terrible explosion. I was in the room. And his face was covered with boiling mashed potatoes. The top of the kettle hit the ceiling, making a big dent, would have smashed his head in if he'd been leaning a nickel forward. And his eyesight was saved by his glasses. And we drove him to Morristown Hospital. I was sitting in the back of him, and he was whimpering. And all that trip, I was cursing the son of a bitch idiots who had designed that machine with no interlock to prevent letting off the steam. A 9-year-old could see that you could design it so that you couldn't possibly open it first. But the dumbass techies who designed the thing simply figured, well, you follow this sequence and that's all there is to it. They didn't know how the human mind worked. Those people are still designing software today. So on that day began my war with the techies, and it continues to the present day because the computer world is essentially based entirely upon a few traditions, and by some kind of magic they make you believe that they have done something incredibly radical, incredibly innovative, and they impose a world upon you based upon these computer traditions and say, here, this is the new world you must obey. The concept of technology that is generally out there in the field is a force that must be obeyed, whereas I see technology as options. The choices we can make should have open to us for our lives. Well, I think I'll jump to the other screen just to give you a foretaste. In fact, there's no point in dawdling. Hard to see, but they've got the wrong glasses on. There we are. All right. So this is the most recent instantiation of the document structure I've been working on all these years. You have to understand, software is interfaces, which are movies, and data structure, which is political. The politics of software and who decides and designs what is what it's all about. So the political fight I'm having, trying to create deep documents, has been rather tough. I'll switch it off now for a moment. Well, that was the foretaste. When I looked at the computer screen, when I thought about computer screens in 1960, I didn't see one for another 5 years. But when I started thinking about them, I said, what do we want our documents to do that you can't do on paper? How do we improve on paper? Well, the first thing you want is to have every connection, every quotation connected right to its origin. So you click on it and jump right and see the original context. I mean, wouldn't you want that? So that's the first thing. Second, you don't want anything lost. Whatever, if the machine breaks, you've saved everything in whatever form you like. Also, you want to be able to go back to any previous versions. Also, you want to branch sideways from any previous version. I say this to the techies, and they say, huh? What happened was, the tradition as of 1960, when I started, already there was a decade and more of computer tradition, and the two traditions principally are, everything is represented as hierarchy. Well, it scales, but how much of your life is hierarchical? Mine is not. Everything is deeply intertwingled. And the problem is how to represent the intertwingularity, the depth of connection in all the ways you want to keep track of, not how to fit it to the way somebody invented databases at IBM in 1976. So, what else do you want to document? You want to be able to write marginal notes on anything and have them appear. You want to be able to couple two documents side by side, see their connections as visible lines, hop from one to the other, see the differences. You want to be able to make links of any kind in profusion, not the kind of links we see in hypertext today. Now, actually, let me read an interesting quote, if I've got it here. If I have it, I'll skip it. Mostly wrong, but the spirit is correct. Ted Nelson, and then I'll tell you who wrote it. Ted Nelson, a professional visionary, wrote in 1965 of literary machines, computers that would enable people to write and publish in a new nonlinear format which he called hypertext. Hypertext was, quote, non-sequential text in which a reader was not constrained to read in any particular order, but could follow links and delve into the original document from a short quotation. Ted described a futuristic project Xanadu in which all the world's information could be published in hypertext. For example, if you were reading in this book in hypertext, you'd be able to follow a link from my reference to Xanadu to further details of that project. In Ted's vision, every quotation would have been a link back to its source, allowing original authors to be compensated by a very small amount each time the quotation was read. He had the dream of a utopian society in which all information could be shared among people who communicated as equals. He struggled for years to find funding for his project, but success eluded him. Now, what's interesting is that this is written by Tim Berners-Lee, creator of the World Wide Web, which I consider a severe dumb-down in my work. And you'll also notice such words as visionary and futuristic, which essentially are the same as quixotic, meant to suggest that it's impossible. But the problem is really that people rarely will hear all the parts. They fit together very simply, but in today's happy-go-lucky, hurried world, people have an attention span of 3 syllables, and there's very little way to get a complicated message across, even if it's not complicated when you get to the end. All right, now we shall jump to the other. So here is the current instantiation of the Xanadu structure. Other one, please. Yeah.
Manual
Yeah,
override.
there we go. Yeah, thank you, Maynard. Okay, so here we have a hypertext in space of some 11 pages. It goes rather smoothly. This is in OpenGL, which is the gamer's graphical system. But as Edwin, as founder of, as various people are attributed to having said, why should the devil have all the best tunes? Now, what are we looking at? We're looking at a document which consists of 11 pages, but I wrote this one in order to show the possible connections between the others. So it's in 3D. So this is biblical and other origins, and we just want to show how quotation works, so you can see the origins of a quotation. So here's our first quotation. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. This is the current page. This is the companion page. Nasty flicker. In any case, in the beginning God created the heaven and earth is from, of course, the King James Genesis. And how do we get there? Well, we'll make that the present page, jumping over, and we see the original context of the quotation. So I have just shown you what was one of the prime desiderata in 1960, connecting every quotation to its origin. Now, we go back to this as the current page. I'm very sorry about the flicker. You want to, is there some?
I'm sorry, there's nothing to do.
Okay, thank you anyway. So anyway, and it's your computer too. So we go down to the next one. I'll step back up. So the current quotation there was in the beginning God created the heaven and earth. We step down to the next quotation. Adam and Lilith immediately began to fight. Now, you've all heard of Adam and Eve. I'm sure some of the more sophisticated among you have heard of Adam and Lilith. And here is her origin in one particular apocryphal book, the Alphabet of Sirah. Now, what just happened when we jumped between context? I'll put these 2 pages over here. The current page is on the left, the companion page is on the right, and as we step back up to the Genesis quote, we see the other page swarf into position to make that the companion page. So people have said to me, how in the world can you sort out among thousands of links? And the answer is, you have to use animation. You have to use interaction. And that's where we part company from paper. You see, I asked in 1960, how can we improve on paper? But who established the visible architecture of today's computer world? The old architecture of the computer world, as I said, was hierarchy. On top of that was put the PARC user interface, Xerox, Palo Alto Research, etc. What's called the modern GUI, I prefer to call the PUI, the PARC user interface, which consists of all those windows you see and so-called WYSIWYG documents. The term WYSIWYG standing for what you see is what you get. Now this came with so-called word processing. Someone in the game said, what's the difference between word processing and desktop publishing? I don't know. These are damn fool marketing terms. The real point is they're simulating paper. Now the key point, actually, I say the dividing line where it all began to go wrong was in a project at Brown University with a certain Swarthmore alumnus I will not name. When we thought about the fundamental issue, he said, I want this all to be printed out on paper. And I said, how can you improve on paper if it all has to map to paper? If you can only show what can be on paper, you are putting cement around your feet. It's like, to imitate the past is like the early horseless carriages with sockets for buggy whips. It's like tearing the wings off a 747 and driving it on the interstate as a bus. If you're going to have screen interaction, we can lift off from paper. But no, as Xerox, Palo Alto, Research Center. First of all, their first text project was to replicate Doug Engelbart's, a word about Doug. The great man of the 20th and 21st century in my field is Douglas C. Engelbart, who's still with us. And he came up with the ideas we call word processing, outline processing, text on a screen, 3 years ahead of me. And he also he's only famous for inventing the mouse. But in fact, what he did was much more important. However, he and I are close friends principally because we are equally indignant about the way things have developed. Because he has seen his proposals for collaboration at screens go all to hell. If you look at his 1968 demo, which is on the web, unfortunately broken into little pieces, but it's going to be available as one consecutive video, you will see the extraordinary things he had working in 1968, all of which now have turned to rubble. But that was that vision. It was a kind of a techie vision because he saw things as hierarchical, but he had one-way links, which is essentially the modern hypertext. Well, in the project I'm referring to at Brown University, I said, look, we want to get away from paper. No, I was told we have to stick to paper. And so that meant one-way links, and it meant essentially the world. That project became the World Wide Web, and I'm deeply sorry for my participation in it, because it broke everything I believed in and was trying to achieve. So here then is the essence of what I've been telling you about. And that's all there is to it. You can learn it in 5 minutes. The whole point is to be able to zoom around in a huge body of stuff. And this is, of course, just a prototype with a small amount of a small number of pages. But it's scriptable so that we could, in principle, do all kinds of different effects with text. We had one demo, in fact, where the texts are shown as loops. Or we can show them as coming at you and getting smaller at the top and bigger in the center and smaller at the bottom and so on. The whole point is to represent ideas. You see, the techie notion of documents are characters in sequence. To me, a document is a package of ideas created by minds for presentation to minds and preservation. And however we may best present these things, this is up for grabs. And finding the best finding new forms of presentation instead of the paper simulation we now have on the web with these little JavaScript windows and rollovers and trivial effects that minutely change the simulation of paper. Okay. Well, the choice point is. Should I go for zigzag or should we go to discussion? Zigzag. All right. Okay. So I have two principal designs in the last 4 years. What you've just seen is the Xanadu design. I'll say a few words about the interior of it. Conventional documents are represented on computers as boxes of characters in sequence. The first box of characters in sequence format was the text file. So ABC. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Now, then they added formatting, and they did it at Xerox PARC with something, I believe at PARC, with something called RTF, where they scrambled in colors and font sizes. To me, this is like, in the same way that adding stereo to audio has created enormous complication with very little benefit. Fonts have created enormous complication with very little benefit. But but we can have them. The only problem is that they've distracted us from what I consider to be the real tasks of the presentation of ideas. So if we have, so we had first plain text, then fonts were added, and then came WYSIWYG. Now the origin of this expression is rather curious. At Xerox PARC they were replicating Doug Engelbart's system, but the guys were too impatient. They didn't like it. And then a guy named Chuck Simoni started putting fonts on the screens of their Alto computers, which they built themselves. And I said, wow, fonts. Whoa, look at this dude. And that was Project Bravo. And suddenly that got all the attention. And a guy named John Siebold, who had been introducing typesetting to computers, came and looked at it and said, yes, that's it. And he came up with a slogan, which he got from a comedian named Flip Wilson. The expression was, what you see is what you get. Flip Wilson would dress up as a character named Geraldine. What you see is what you get. And then this was abbreviated as WYSIWYG. And everybody said, ah, that's what we want. Now, what's the context? At this time in 1974, Xerox was the Google of its day. It was a vast money machine because they had a monopoly on plain paper copying. They thought it would last forever. They didn't quite understand about the expiration of patents. They sure didn't understand about Japan. And so they essentially, they wanted to sell printing machines. Right? And so when they saw a way that people could make fonts on paper and then print it out, and of course get it wrong, and print it again, and print it again, wow, that's the way to go. And so WYSIWYG became the basis of their system. Now, but they couldn't sell it. They created something called the Xerox Star, which was the first PUI, that is, Windows on a screen. Now, who invented Windows on a screen? Xerox PARC often gets the credit. Doug Engelbart invented Windows on a screen. And they had it with a mouse. Who invented the mouse? Doug Engelbart invented the mouse. But nevertheless, you see people give credit, PARC credit for it. And they packaged all this on a machine called the Star, and it was an $80,000 machine for secretaries to do fancy typesetting. Now, if you are a boss and you have an $80,000 budget, are you going to spend it on her or yourself? Okay? Nobody's going to buy a secretarial machine for $8,000. So they walked Steve Jobs through there. In the famous walkthrough for Steve Jobs, he said, I can sell this. And he did. But first he created the Lisa, which was a failure, and then he created the Macintosh, which was a smash. And Apple has posed as being the liberator. Now, it's very interesting. Could you please hold up? Oh, you're holding the camera. Well, could someone else hold the camera while you hold up computer lid?
Way over in a box in the corner over there.
Someone else get it? Oh. No, the computer lid. Never mind. Never mind. There's a book out there which we can handle it gently for $350. No. Carl will do it. Carl knows.
It's not in the bag, it's in the box on the floor, a blue and white box on the floor.
There's a bag on the floor, I don't see.
There's no box.
There is, it was on a chair.
Oh, okay. There's the box.
Dig down, it's the big one.
No,
No,
large
it's-
format.
It takes it about the size of this space.
Okay.
There you go.
Here it is.
There you go.
I published this book in 1976, attempting to get backing, or at least attempting to make money to support myself while I did my designs. This didn't work. But it became a so-called classic, and the attitude was one of defiant innovation. And a company called Apple adopted the posture it now holds from this book. So essentially, Apple, I would say that the Apple Corporation's whole corporate style is from Computer Lib. Thank you, Carl. So they posed as these great innovators, but in fact, all they did was they took, first the Apple II was packaging a standard computer, albeit a very nice one. The operating system came up with a program called Hello, which I thought was good. When they came up with the IBM PC, the program that corresponded to Hello on the Apple II was called AutoExec.bat. Which, to me, epitomized the stupidity of what was happening. Now, so Apple first popularized standard computers with the Apple II, a very nice package, and they then popularized the Xerox PARC interface, the PUI, with the Macintosh. But there were no new ideas in this package. These were standard WYSIWYG documents to which they had added fonts. And then in whatever it was, Tim Berners-Lee comes along with this World Wide Web thing and takes the standard hierarchical directories of the individual computers and butters them all together into one vast hierarchy of all the available directories in the world that they're all the, whoever wants to make directories available on their computers in the world can do so. And so now we have one vast hierarchical directory, it's called URL, and creates this one-way font with one-way links, and that's what people now call hypertext. And to me, I regret this very deeply because it means that none of the things you really want for documents is in there, and everybody has to deal with the issues of version management, distribution and modifications, annotation, forget it, third-party links, forget it, being able to quote with access to the origins, forget it. So that's why I fight on. Now, unfortunately, what I've shown you, my designs won't work in a web browser, won't work in the standard thing, because the web browser and the standard things are all designed around the standard text structure. So that's where I stand. I'm still trying to get this productized, and how long that will take, I don't know, but stay youthful and stay angry. Okay, let's go to the other computer, and we'll talk about structure now. The standard view of structure, well, we have several kinds of structure now that are allowed in the world. There's hierarchical structure, and in the 70s, someone named Dan Bricklin came up with something called electronic spreadsheet. Actually, he wasn't the inventor of electronic spreadsheet. In my book, it says who really was, but I forget. But the point is that his spreadsheet, VisiCalc, took off like gangbusters. And everybody said, oh boy, now we have that kind of structure. The only problem with spreadsheet is that the bigger it gets, it's like the Sahara. It gets bigger and bigger and emptier and emptier. And if you create a column, it bisects the universe. If you create a row, it bisects the universe. The model does not scale. It's very nice for small problems, but otherwise, no. And how did we get database? I refer especially to relational database, which runs much of the world. Well, that was created by a fellow named Edgar Codd at IBM. And the way it was told to me, I haven't been able to confirm this, he had 500 PhDs working under him, and he had 13 axioms, which of course are called Codd's 12 rules. and then IBM said to him, well, you've got 2 more years to make a product. And he said, product? And quit in a huff. And so the SQL language, which runs relational database, was created by his successors. Codd despised SQL. So who designed today's databases? Nobody. It's Codd's notion that you have equal length rows with all kinds of metaphysical arguments for this, and then the SQL language, which was designed by somebody else as an afterthought. And because Oracle is such a fabulous sales outfit, they just bought Sun, for God's sake. Everybody thinks this is how it has to be. But if you know anything about it, you know how difficult it is to rearrange databases in this new world and to reconcile them. Forget it. Now, I'm a minimalist. I believe in simple ideas. They may be hard to explain because they're counter-paradigm. It's very hard to explain an idea that disagrees with somebody's paradigm because you have to have 1,000 answers when they don't see the simplicity of it. There's a wonderful cartoon, which I should have here, which shows a complicated swing as it would have been, or taken down by the salesman, the complicated swing the customer wanted, the way the engineering department made it, the way it went through quality control, etc., and this whole mess of ropes and slats. And what the customer actually wanted was a tire hanging from a rope. And that, to me, is a picture of so many things in this world, and how everything turns from a simple idea into a goddamn mess unless you have essentially a dictator at the top saying, maintaining simplicity. This is why Stephen Wolfram is one of my heroes because he has successfully created a vast mathematical system which is very clean. Okay, so in 1983, it occurred to me, what if you had a table where if you went 3 to the right and 2 down, you didn't get to the same place as if you went 2 down and 3 to the right?
Oh, God.
Welcome to zigzag. So the point is, this is a free-form structure made of individual connections among free-form cells. And you can download this from xanadu.com/zigzag, play with it yourself. And it's very powerful, and it gives you an unbounded free-form database. Now, in conventional database, you have to have one database for names and addresses, another for this, another for that. Hey, my life isn't like that. I would like to keep track of my publications. It's very hard. Where I've lectured, when I lectured, who was the contact person, where did we stay, where did we eat, did we have a good time, what was going on there, what else was happening? Well, you can't put all that in an SQL row, but you sure as heck can handle it in the system I'm about to show you. Again, alas, a prototype. This prototype was done by Tuomas J. Luka in Finland. It is a beautiful job. Unfortunately, work on it has stopped, and we are off to the next instantiation. So let's see. Here we have 2 windows. They are 2 windows on the very same thing. They're 2 windows on the same thing. We have a green cursor, which essentially is, think of a celluloid overlay, thank you, on that cell, and a blue cursor, which is a celluloid overlay on that cell, and these cursors will move. Why are the 2 windows different? Because that's the row view and that's the stretch vanishing view. So you can look at this in different ways. And the separation between the views can become greater and greater, so you need at least 2 views. But it's a table right now in that 2 rows and, pardon me, 2 columns and 3 rows. But regularity is an option. So if I want to insert a cell there, I can. Notice it's been inserted on both sides, but it looks different on the right, on the left, because of the way that form of refreshment happens to work. Now the point is that with this you can build anything. And let's look at a nice example. We'll look at the royal families of Europe. So in this column are a number of royal personages from various decades, put in by my colleague Adam Moore. He got it from a PDF supplied by Buckingham Palace and heaven knows what else. And they're in alphabetical order. So Beatrix, Queen of the Netherlands, for example. So if we put both, if we put both cursors on the same, we see in the stretch vanishing view, we see her full title, whereas we don't see it there. Now, one of the interesting things is I've tied together all of the monarchs of Netherlands and the orange in this column, and orange in this column, so we can pop back to any one of them from this listing over here. So it's very powerful in ways. I know we're going fast, and this may be a little tricky, but I'll get to something which is very cute. I discovered this in a doctor's office in Tokyo while I had an extra hour. The cursors are on Elizabeth II, monarch of Great Britain, currently. And right now we're looking horizontally at dimension 1. Oh, doesn't, yeah, you see it here. Horizontally dimension 1, vertically dimension 2. We're not bothering with dimension 3. These are the axes that we're looking at. And we'll be changing these axes in a minute. Horizontally here on dimension 1, vertically on dimension 2. But let us now pivot in the left. So we'll look horizontally at dimension date. So we go to dimension 4, dimension 2, dimension 3, dimension date. And here's when Elizabeth was born, 1926. In other words, that cell was hanging out along dimension date, but we didn't see it in the previous view. Now let's find out if she's married. I shall pivot in the right-hand window to dimension marriage. Sure enough, she's married to Philip. Vertically, we pivot to dimension children, and there they are, Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. We've left out Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed and all of them. Take additional dimensions. Now, I didn't set out to create a genealogy program. Someone said, oh, well, for genealogy you need this. I didn't set out to create a genealogy program. We just put this in, and look what happens when you go to the vanishing view. We've got a traversable family tree that you can wander around in and find, for example, where is she? Queen Victoria? No, she's up a different way. I should memorize the route. But these are all those same people assembled according to parentage. So it shows you that you can have, that by crafting the views interestingly, and by representing with a generalized system of cells of this kind, you can do all the things you could do in a conventional database and much more. And more minimalistically. I could teach you to use this in half an hour, where to learn database is several weeks and a lot of practice. So that's what I do. These are my two principal designs, as usual. See, the point is, people say, well, why don't you just go to venture capitalists? The point is that if you want to keep control of a project and do it right, you have to do it on the cheap. And that's the hard part. And there's no enemy like a backer. And anyway, so there we are, and I'll be happy to entertain discussion.
Ted, could I just I just wanted to mention one thing. He's emphasized text in both of these structures, in the documents and in zigzag. But these cells could have photographs or other images. They could have audio in them. So you could have commentary on your grandmother's photographs. You could have dimensions for all kinds of other media. And the same thing with those strips in Xanadu space. The intention is that you can have audio and video there as well, so that you can have comments on a little section of audio, or linked sections of audio to text, or make all kinds of interconnections.
And thank you for the opportunity to introduce my sweet partner, Marlene Malikow, my collaborator for these several years. 18 years. Yeah.
And you also have formulas.
Sure. Look, this is a prototype. You can add all kinds of stuff. I have certain notions for how it should be developed in the canonical version. But obviously, people can do anything they like with this. The generic term we selected for this is hyperorthogonal structure, because it's orthogonal in as many dimensions as you like, with arbitrary connections between any two cells along any dimensions. The trademark, which I have registered, is zigzag for my own instantiation of it. Yeah.
Sometime in the 70s, I believe, in the Swarthmore publication, and at my age, I don't remember the name, someone, and it may have been you, wrote about computers as communication device, because at that time, people like me, and I think you're right, thought computers were number crunchers. What do we know? Anyway, someone wrote a lovely article about computers as communication devices. Was that you?
I did have a piece in the Alumni Bulletin in 1970. I don't know if that's one we were thinking about.
That's probably it. And it said, hey, these are not for numbers.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, I mean, there could have been
Listening
somebody
to you
else
has
as
brought
well.
that back
I don't
in
know.
my mind, and
Yeah.
I just wondered.
It could be. Yeah.
Would you describe zigzag as open source, and if so, what does that mean?
Okay, first of all, please identify if you are
You.
Run. The open source, this is an open source version, which you can find, done in Finland. I'm not so hot on open source. I'm approaching it very gingerly with the toe in the water attitude. I consider Richard Stallman to be a friend. I hugely admire his trickery in establishing the genre. It's not what most people think. It's entirely based upon copyright law, as distinct from ending copyright law. And a number of other things like this. So it's a long discussion. Yes.
A number of years ago, Ted added to my vocabulary a word which I'd like to share with everybody, and I'll tell you the context. I was in the process of moving a company from card readers to computers. And I had asked for a few for accounting purposes, asked for a few basic things. The ability to immediately get the information if I needed it for a particular account, the ability to read it immediately in English, and the ability to manage somehow to be able to manually correct it immediately. And had been told, "Oh, Mr. Friedman, you have no idea what you're asking for." I told this to Ted, and I'll tell you what Ted said to me. He said, "You know, Bob, computers are very simple. It's all zeros and ones. You took binary the mathematics, you know." He said, "I'll tell you what I call that. I call that cyber crud." And it's a word that has stuck with me, Ted, for years, and I found incredibly useful, and I thought I got to share it, since a lot of what you've been talking about is indeed cyber crud.
And deception, whether intentional or not, deception as to what's possible is a widespread issue. But it's also, it is true that many things are more difficult than they look. Yep. And that's,
You spoke earlier about,
what's your name?
you spoke earlier about an idea that almost a class of people, techies, have managed to create a world system of life in which hierarchy is imposed on us by their creations, by the very attractiveness of those creations. They can be almost
Well put.
So
Louder.
where do you see that going? What are you doing about it?
First of all, there are many mansions in the computer world. There are factions and subcultures and cults with many different views. And as long as any of them has a living member, it continues in its own direction. The momentum of the hierarchical file system is such that nothing will ever stop it. So I have to learn to live around it, create a meta level in which it is no longer imposed on the user. But when they design file systems, in principle, a file system could do anything because there are about 5 or 6 basic instructions. The file system is the program that manages your files. And on the Macintosh you have one type, on the Windows you have a couple more, but you can mount other types of file systems, and they're all alike, not because they have to be, but because they're going to be. One guy, Hans Reiser, was designing a whole database system on top in his file structure, but unfortunately, he's just been sentenced to prison for murder, and so we've lost that initiative. But in principle, you could embed any programs, whatever, inside the file system, so that a command of the file system, so clicking on a picture of an icon of a file could invoke a program, could do all sorts of things, and the structure of the objects inside the file system could have any type. But that's a project, big one.
Also, some people like hierarchy, it makes them feel more organized and so on. You can map hierarchy into zigzag if that's what you want. And some things are naturally hierarchical, like, I forget your examples, the military.
Einstein said, everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. My corollary to that is everything should be as hierarchical as necessary, but no more so. Take a pan of the whole, it's good. Great, thanks. Yeah.
Well, now that you're stuck with a hierarchical system, is there any way you can suck the information out and then play with it as you described? I mean, the information is there, you just don't like the way it's organized. Why can't you reorganize it?
Well, it's not that I don't like the way particular information is organized. I don't like to have to live with forcing hierarchy on my stuff, which is non-hierarchical.
Well,
And a lot of other people, I'm sure, would feel the same way.
Yeah, but the information is there, and it seems to me what you're talking about is a way to manipulate the information.
Well, yes, but that's like saying the information is there in the library, and all you're talking about putting it on the screen is having a way to manipulate it. Yeah, but
But also, we would want to have a
databases.
really what I'm asking.
Exactly. We would
Because I
want
think that's
utilities.
what you're gonna have to do.
Exactly. You don't want to have to redo everything. You want to be able to move it into zigzag and then expand on it. So
All
that
that's
would,
gonna be done, of course.
that would be one of our goals.
But again, we're trying to get the prototype working, and it's a long way to all the other things you would want along with it.
I have a suggestion for Project Xanthi. It comes from something that I read about why micropayments never took off.
This is by Bob Cotton.
His observation was that the decision to buy anything has a transaction cost. And people sit there deciding, do I want this, do I not want it? And then the time it takes them to come to this decision is such that they usually answer no. So what we've seen happen to get around this is subscriptions of one kind or another. And I admit to having several, like Rhapsody Music and some book subscriptions on the ACM website and so on, where for a fixed fee per year, you have access to a large number of different things. Perhaps this could be used in your Xanadu idea of subscription to get you around the transaction costs of buying very small numbers of things.
Thank you. The original idea, which I still stand by, and by the way, I coined the word micropayment long ago, was that the whole point was to have everything accessible to everybody, and that meant, that would have to mean, in a world where publishing is an industry, that would have to mean purchase. Now, the kiddies coming up now say everything's going to be free, but the university presses are still holding it very tight to themselves. Bertelsmann and Disney and so on will continue to have those patents for those copyrights for as long as we can imagine. So my notion has always been that you'd have automatic micropayment when you clicked on something, you'd be aware that it was there, and have an idea of how much you were spending. But then you would own the piece that you acquired. So that you would acquire an article or a book not by buying the book in advance, but a sentence at a time, if you wished. and that meant that if somebody quoted a sentence in their piece, then you would just buy the piece necessary to fill in the quotation and say, oh gosh, I'd like to see more of that. And what is important about this is it's principled and it's doable. The only problem is that you need permission from the publishers. We got one publisher, Abril in Brazil, to sign on. The only problem is we haven't got that part of the program working yet either. Yeah.
So the thing I haven't heard mentioned in this talk is about hardware.
About what?
Hardware.
About what?
Hardware.
Hardware.
Right, and so I just wonder how much, right, so they're all Turing complete, we can do whatever we want with them.
Please
great.
speak more slowly.
Sorry. So they're all Turing complete, we can do whatever we want with them, great. But how much of the interfaces that we're dealing with today are kind of evolved out of sort of the constraints of the physical implementations that, the software needs to run on?
I'm not interested in the interfaces we're doing today. I'm doing my own thing.
Right, I understand that, but if you're kind of railing against sort of what we got, I mean, how much has that evolved from?
No, I think it's all opinion and imagination.
Okay.
Because, as I said, a movie maker can make a monster with a reaction shot. And if there's a certain effect you want, you can figure out how to do it at every level of budget. And the fact that we now have luscious tools, which unfortunately have very, very specific ways they have to be fitted together, isn't getting us away from all the Xerox PARC conventions and all the extra clickings they put in.
I was wondering, it looks like you wouldn't be able to make the entire internet we have now, more like Xanadu. It's all built in already. But would you think of something like if a corporation had a supercomputer, could they take a large portion of the internet and bring it in somehow, like on a server?
Well, they have.
And then format it in Xanadu space?
Thank you. First,
First,
excellent, thank you. There's two parts of the answer. One is that Brewster Kahle at the Internet Archive has done just that. He's been slurping up the internet, slurping up the World Wide Web for, what now, about 10 years. And you can go back to any given URL at a given point in time, and see what was there. Now, reforming it for Xanadu is fairly trivial. The real issue is the problem of change, because a Xanadu document is built of pieces brought from different places, and it requires that they be stable and not be independent. The effect you want, you can figure out how to do it at every level of budget. And the fact that we now have luscious tools, which unfortunately have very, very specific ways they have to be fitted together, isn't getting us away from all the Xerox PARC conventions and all the extra clickings they put in.
I was wondering, it looks like you wouldn't be able to make the entire internet we have now, more like Xanadu. It's all built in already. But would you think of something like if a corporation had a supercomputer, could they take a large portion of the internet and bring it in somehow, like on a server?
Oh, yeah.
And then format it in Xanadu space?
Thank you.
So they can have their
First-
own little piece of data.
Excellent, thank you. There's two parts of the answer. One is that Brewster Kahle at the Internet Archive has done just that. He's been slurping up the Internet, slurping up the World Wide Web for what now, about 10 years. And you can go back to any given URL at a given point in time, and see what was there. Now, reforming it for Xanadu is fairly trivial. The real issue is the problem of change, because a Xanadu document is built of pieces brought from different places, and requires that they be stable and not be independently changed at whim. So that is a set of conventions which anyone who wants to play our game has to hold to. For those who are not playing the game, we have to figure ways around it, like caching a given web page at a given time. But this is obviously, thank you for that question, because the whole issue is how to bring about a minority structure in a world that's based in a different way. Yeah.
Peter Oppenheim. Hi, Dave. I guess my biggest problem with this is that I can't understand why I would ever want to organize my information in your way.
Fine, one less complaining customer.
I'm really happy with the web the way it is.
Exactly. Yeah, there we are.
I can look up information, I can learn anything I want. It takes seconds to jump from one page to another. I don't like organizing information, I like jumping around.
I don't see an argument there.
So-
I agree, you don't like organizing. I agree, you like what you like.
Right. But, so why should I organize it?
I didn't say either. Do what you like, for God's sake.
Okay. But you have basically an organizational structure
Several.
here. Yes, multi-dimensional organizational structure. And I just have trouble getting my head around the multi-dimensional organizational structure because somebody has to organize it, and I'll be damned if I want to organize anything.
Well, yes.
Be optimistic about the paperless medical record.
Well, now these are political issues. See, so many of these things turn to politics right away, because there's the arguments about privacy, and which have gone too far, because it means that many epidemiological things cannot be tracked because people are withholding their records when it hardly matters. But the other issue is that government cannot be trusted to keep anything private. And how this is going to play out, I haven't the foggiest idea. In England, it's blowing up in crud, and probably will here too. I don't know if you know the Farber mailing list. They continually have Dave Farber's interesting pieces on that. They continually have a lot of interesting stuff on the politics of government databases, and medical database is almost a government database in the sense that it's a meta-government. Are you a doctor? Yeah. Okay. They said, I remember being told in the 1960s, oh, doctors will never touch keyboards. Oh, authors will never touch keyboards.
Hi. Are you talking about practical things? Are there technical things that are bothering you that you feel that you can't do, that you don't have the math for, or that you're working on, or
I'm not a programmer.
bothering you, or that?
I'm not a programmer. I've been working at the medical lab, and the problem was I had to earn a living by the time that the system language, in particular C, was available. And the question is always, do I play catch-up ball and learn some language, or do I continue with the hard work I'm doing on documentation and trying to persuade other people? And I wish the hell I could do it myself.
Try Python.
Pardon?
Try Python.
Thanks. Yes,
Are you a Python programmer?
Yeah.
let's
to
talk.
Okay.
The Xanadu space is basically written in Python. Yeah.
We met last month.
Yes.
And became fast friends.
We became friends fast.
I think I'm not going to lose your friendship now. We have geeks, nerds, and 15 things. And I would like to suggest just one word, grind. And run. And that's me. Okay, and you can see the Erie Canal. And it's a great idea, and so on, and we see it now. However, we need guys with shovels before it becomes a thing. And it's either the devil or the God or whatever, but success is in the details. So you have this conception which looks great to me. But now there needs to be some lines to make the little parts work. But you're acting like they are either unnecessary or wrong-headed.
Why am I acting like that?
Well, I hear you say all these things.
No, I said the problem is finding the ones who will buy into the concept.
That's what I was just about to say. You have to have good grinds. There are poor and wonderful imaginers and good wonderful imaginers and poor grinds and good grinds. I think you need to be looking for some good grinds. I'd help you, but I'm too old. You need to find some other grinds.
Well, I know two Python programmers. They're called bears.
I'll pursue this which is the hard part of this task, it seems, is that, and this relates to the history of computers. Programming computers is a very unforgiving task. It doesn't work if you're not correct to every comma. And one thing an analogy that occurred to me when we were discussing typesetting earlier on, and you mentioned WYSIWYG, was I was wondering to myself, well, what do you think about TeX? TeX is a document publishing system produced by Donald Knuth, who refused to publish his papers in the AMS journals because they couldn't typeset them well enough. They were ugly at the time. So he took a couple years off from his work at Stanford.
Note that he had tenure at Stanford and had
And he was brilliant.
That didn't hurt. So what I'm specifically interested in here is that Knuth made a tool which was as unforgiving as any of the other programming languages out there, but which also has been used and took over the field of scientific publishing to produce the highest quality typesetting more or less available within the field. And that led directly to the ability of mathematicians and engineers and scientists all over the world to communicate in the form they wanted, I think.
Would you like to contrast that with APL?
I would like to if I felt more sure of my knowledge of the language.
APL being another form of communicating mathematics, which was not paper-oriented, whereas Knuth's TeX is WYSIWYG, and therefore another case
Well,
of paper.
it's not WYSIWYG, but it is
It
paper.
is WYSIWYG. Oh, pardon me. It's still paper destined. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is paper destined, and unreservedly so. It is a language for programming paper documents and to achieve any layout of text and boxes on that paper.
And it is thus looking at mathematics canonically as a system of representations in two dimensions, as distinct from APL, which was representations in, well, one dimension, you could say, but much more powerful.
So my question is, relating to your system, you seem to be very hung up on interfaces, which is that you have a strong idea in your head of what the data representation should look like and what operation should be possible in the representation. I want to be able to traverse along these dimensions. I want to be able to, in some sense, push these keys, and here's the view that should result. Here's the movie I'm trying to make. What's the take on what interface is appropriate to achieve that goal, given the cost structure that you're fighting with?
But my approach to interface is WYSIWYG. What you see is what you never could before. And all interfaces are legitimate. So I'd like to provide an opening interface. and a strong structure that remains constant. And I really don't give a damn what other interfaces people want to make. Let 100 flowers bloom on the interface level. But again, you're right that the sales level has to be something people can relate to.
The gentleman over there was talking about the unforgivingness of this, and yet it seems to me that at least Google is starting, in some sense, to solve this, because I suspect that if I typed in Ted Nielsen, Oxford, something like that, it probably would come back with you and say, did you mean Ted Nelson?
Right. So that's an interface to their vast grid of index terms.
Right.
So it's really the vast grid of index terms that's happening here.
Yeah, but I mean, for example, if I put in on a particular AOL weather thing, I want to see the weather in Port St. Lucie, Florida, and I write in Port, P-O-R-T, St. Lucie, it'll come back and say no such place. I have to write in P-T, St. Lucie.
Whereas Google knows the synonyms.
And Google knows the synonyms. So it seems to me an awful lot of what we're getting is unforgiving, and yet if Google can do it, surely other people can do it.
Google, on the other hand, I use Gmail because it's convenient and fast, but I hate the interface. And there's an opportunity, by the way, because since Gmail can be used as a POP server, anybody can create a new interface for Gmail if they wanted to.
Like a zigzag base.
Yeah.
How long ago, your book is printed one at a time when you order them.
Which book?
The new one.
In Geek.
Oh, yeah.
I know that was your idea from like 40 years ago or so. When
I
did
was
this,
never interested in printing.
but the concept of not wasting all the books that you print on demand and been paid.
Don't attribute to me every good idea in the world. That's right.
My understanding was that was your idea.
No,
okay.
but print on demand was an old idea, and I since I published Computer Lib, I had these boxes of books I was stuck with, and so it's very convenient. By the way, I recommend Lulu.com enormously. The cost of publishing the book was $8.45, and the covers are spankingly
The main
nice.
thing is the author's percentage of the cover price is like 45%, which is huge if you compare it to normal publishing contracts.
And you, as soon as you approve the final one, it's right there, and anybody can order it. Anyway, I interrupted.
No, that's okay. No, I bought your book. I just thought that was wondering what the time frame was for this printing of book one, as needed, one by one.
Time frame? Meaning?
Oh,
when it started, I don't know. Lula's been around for about 4 years. It was founded by one of the Red Hat founders. Yeah.
And there are some programming interfaces, and I use Alley Code for HTML, where you do your programming in an environment that will catch obvious mistakes. That will flag if you haven't closed a parenthesis, or if you put a comma where it should have been a semicolon, and it will color that red and say, did you mean that?
What's the name of that?
Alley Code is the HTML one. There are similar things for C, and I'm sure there are similar interfaces for other languages, and if there aren't, there ought to be. Because, why should everybody have to go back through 3,000 lines of code to find the one semicolon that should have been a comma?
As I look at your random Photoshop, you fade in and out, and you go behind something that's not showing, and say you wanted to add a dimension of who married who, when they were divorced, or whatever.
Okay, now you're talking about zigzag, not that.
Zigzag, okay, zigzag. But you can make it come and go on the screen, but you can't show what you're doing on paper.
Right.
Well, this is not to translate the paper at all.
I guess it can translate to paper, can it?
Well, you can figure out ways to print it out, but they don't. But you're going to lose something.
You can't print every dimension at once, but you could print the list of names, or you could
print the list of marriages.
But since screens are universal, and especially now with cell phones, it just seems to me pointless to talk about paper. And I'm evil and retrograde, the phrase I usually use. And when they called me about, what do you think of the Amazon Kindle? Well, it's paper simulation, isn't it? Yeah. No way to annotate it, evil and retrograde.
How are you going to get all our email addresses?
Pardon?
Get yourself a bigger piece of paper and start folding.
Also, that's not a simulation.
You should have just written your email address and have us all send you.
And the printing problem has been in relational databases since they got started.
Yep.
You know, you can't print out an access file. You have to print a report where you choose what you want to appear on the piece of paper.
I just don't know why people put up with it. Yeah.
I mean, do you think we're still using paper as a model because we're still, on a screen, fundamentally stuck in 2 dimensions?
No, I think it's because people are very stuck in their ways. You know the Stockholm syndrome. People come to love their jailers. The Bettelheim reported that the Nazi concentration camp guards were imitated by the prisoners who would goose step. And so everyone becomes extremely loyal to that which they're used to. Yeah.
I'm sort of stunned by one thought, and that is, if you don't want the paper, it means everybody has to have an iPod or something on their person at all.
Everybody doesn't have to do anything. You don't have to use it.
Well, all right, so I need to communicate with my doctor, and who doesn't have the patience to listen to me because I run on so anyway. So I need to give him something, which is a sheet of paper with, "Dear Dr. Rosenbluth, I need this." I got this on my screen. How do I communicate to him? I call him up, ask him to turn his computer on? No, that won't fly.
I send emails to my doctor.
Well, I don't think my doctor can read an email.
Change of documents. Introduce them one. Well, I think that ends the question. Thank you all.